We classified them as bipolar. Well, what happened was your dopamine was low or so low that you needed to build that dopamine. So your explosion, your abundance of anger, your freak out built that dopamine. All right, let's dive into this dopamine presentation. So dopamine is a big topic for me because throughout my life, I have experienced, shall I say, issues with dopamine. And as I progress through my career and my knowledge and learning, a lot of that stuff starts to make sense. And it not only enables me to help myself, but to help others as well. And understanding how impactful dopamine is on like all systems plays a huge role in addressing one's health and, optimizing it. So a lot of people, there's a lot of, floating stuff out there to do with dopamine and everything. So I thought I'd try to break it down as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and the effects of high and low dopamine and how to address them, signs and symptoms and so on and so forth, and kind of like a little bit of explanation of what is dopamine. So I'm going to try out this new slide form as well. So what is dopamine? Dopamine is your get stuff done and motivation neurotransmitter. So pretty simple, like if you're lacking motivation, you are probably lacking dopamine. And that is very common in quite a few individuals. There's the opposite spectrum, which I'll get into. Plays a big role in your metabolism, actually, because indirectly it could also be that motivational aspect, because if you don't have a lot of motivation, you're probably not going to do a lot to improve your metabolism, okay? But you have a lot of, dopamine molecules in the body. There is a ton of them, but you only have about 400,000 neurons that actually produce dopamine. And that's found in between your ears out of 16 billion. So there's not a lot compared to the other neurons. And now dopamine is involved when I say firing neurons, once again, like controlling heart rate, motor recruitment, all that kind of stuff. It plays a huge role. This is why like Parkinson's, for example, is a very low dopamine issue. They have a lot of trouble moving and such. It also plays a role in the reward centers. Now, it's the seeking of the reward though. There's a big misconception there. People think they release dopamine when they get that reward. They're actually releasing dopamine to get to that reward. Remember, it's the motivation neurotransmitter. So a good example of that is take gambling, for instance. If you have like a small payout coming, you're going to release a little bit of dopamine. But if you got a big payout coming, you're going to release a lot more dopamine trying to achieve that payout. As mentioned, some of the most abundant molecules in the body, the half-life of dopamine is around 2 seconds. So I'm going to get into a little bit more of that later in the presentation, but I also wanted to comment on dopamine versus serotonin. So a lot of research is now showing that dopamine is more correlated with depression rather than serotonin. Like it does play a role. I'm not saying that it doesn't. It's just low. How I've learned this is if you have like no serotonin, you're going to feel really crappy. You're going to be depressed, all that kind of stuff. But if you have no dopamine, you die. So it's kind of like illustrating the importance of dopamine, but also they have an inverse relationship. So the higher the serotonin, the lower the dopamine. This is why serotonin is higher in your sleep. But yes, serotonin does, think of it as your vehicle's alternator. It does recharge dopamine. So it's not like, oh, I have no motivation, I should take my serotonin. It doesn't work like that. You want to, it's a healthy balance. So moving forward, now what impacts dopamine? Stress. You guys are probably so annoyed with me saying that now, but stress impacts dopamine. I will comment more on how as we go through the slides. For now, I'm just going to quickly label off gut health, like inflammation, overgrowth of bad bacteria. Antibiotics is a big one. We'll go over some slides quickly. Hormones are going to play a role on how they impact dopamine. Your nutrition, medications, whether it's good or bad, lifestyle, technology, phones, computers, all that kind of stuff. Expectations. So this here, I actually put out my recent pop quiz was what is the best way to build dopamine? And it's having no expectations, because here's an analogy, especially we'll use social media because like so many people, myself included, are trying to increase their engagement and exposure via social media. So you put this time and effort into a post and you feel like it's really good and you have this expectation of that it's going to get 50 to 100 likes. Some other people maybe thousands. For me, 50 would be awesome. Okay. So let's say I have this expectation of 50 likes and I go on there and I post this and I only get 20 likes. I'm going to secrete very little dopamine. I'm going to feel like crap. I'm going to be upset that post did not do well. But if I put that post on, I expected to get like 5 likes. For whatever reason, I just didn't have any expectations of it. Not that I purposely created a poor post. I just had no expectations. And I log on and I got 50 likes. That's going to spike a lot of dopamine. I'm going to feel pretty good. So having low to no expectations not saying like, you know, be a pessimist and kind of idea, but being real sometimes with yourself, having that unbiased opinion and having lower expectations is a great way to build dopamine. And then I put genetics at the bottom because all of this is going to affect genetics, which I'll make a little bit of a comment on. So here are some slides. I'm not going to go in depth. I just want people to see this so they can get a little bit understanding of how the gut, you know, gut health affects dopamine. So like this is like as a baby, and as you age, your gut and brain are developing at the same rate. So if you have, you know, you're using, I'll just be honest here, like transparent, if you're using formula that's full of corn syrup, which is like one of the #1 ingredients in formulas found in Canada anyways, you're going to really slow this rate down. So you're going to have slow development of the brain, which it can also lead to these mental disorders. So you see how they increase and then how these play a role as well, affecting this. So you look at like chronic stress, everything. So just, you can have a good look over this, but this is kind of showing you how the gut is going to affect the brain, which in return is going to affect dopamine. And then here, like this is very complex. I'm just kind of using this to illustrate my point, but it's showing the gut-brain axis, the connection of how healthy lifestyle and nutrition will affect your brain versus a poor. Now, they got meat in here. I don't agree with this. Maybe if we're talking like McDonald's or high fatty grain-fed, grain-finished meat and stuff. But if you're doing like grass-fed, grass-finished, and you have adequate stomach acid and pepsin, right, there's a lot of context involved. The meat is actually very beneficial for you. So don't let that image skew you there. And here's another example of the gut-brain axis and how antibiotics and poor diet and everything affect it and decrease neuroplasticity and increase neuroinflammation. So that's another good article there. So this is actually a plant-based thing, and researchers think, okay, well, this is a plant, not humans. The same thing kind of occurs though. So tyrosine and phenylalanine are required to build dopamine. Poor diet, especially things like glyphosate, so Roundup, will actually block this Shikimate pathway. So then you're not producing these. And same with tryptophan, so serotonin. So this is, once again, too, I'm not going to dive into this. It's quite complex. I just want people to see what is involved when it comes to gut health and dopamine, because gut health is #1. And then here's like, when you look at genetics, we'll talk a little bit about genetics. You can see there's a lot involved with the production, the clearance of dopamine, adrenaline, norepinephrine, epinephrine, things like that. Once again, I'm not going to go into this. This is my own personal. So you can see a lot of flip-flopping everywhere. So hence my dopamine issues throughout my life. And this is actually, this test was taken at a better point in my life. So it would have been interesting to see where I was at a very low point in my life. Let's get into the signs of low dopamine now. Anger. This one's a big one. I'm going to kind of jump around here and explain as to why though. So when we talk about anger, I want to combine this with bipolar. So I'm going to put that up there. Okay. So most of the time when people get angry, if you have that individual that gets angry and they explode on you or some sort of situation, and then they're totally calm afterwards, we classify them as bipolar. Well, what happened was your dopamine was low or so low that you needed to build that dopamine. So your explosion, your abundance of anger, your freak out built that dopamine. So then you got that, what we like to call the feel-good transmitter. So you're good now. You got your fix. You're happy. You're okay. You're satisfied. And so now everybody's wondering, like, why you're so bipolar, you freak out and you're fine the 1 minute. As you can tell, that's a very sensitive subject for me because that's how I was treated through my life. That's simply self-medication. You are trying to build dopamine because your dopamine is low. So your brain's like, give me that dopamine. So let's throw a hissy fit. Children, this is why gut health in children is 100% correlated with temper tantrums. They're simply just trying to build dopamine. They throw a temper tantrum because you wouldn't give them their toy. You give them that toy, they're super happy. All is well in the world. You have calmed that child down. They wanted that food or whatever, you give it to them. They are calm now. But what's happening is you're developing a pattern, and I'll get a little more into that after. But that's where bipolar comes from. Bipolar is just low dopamine. You probably got poor gut health, poor nutrition. You're not sleeping well. You're highly stressed. That's what bipolar is. Addiction is substance abuse. Once again, it's that self-medication. You are trying to build dopamine, so you go to anything really, but substance abuse, we can say like hard drugs, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, for example, or addiction. Like for me, a lot of people, I mean, they might be familiar now, but I was heavily addicted to performance enhancing drugs and substance abuse as well. What happens is you hear that term chasing that dragon. This will go back to everything that spikes dopamine. You spiked dopamine here at one point, but then you adapt to that, and receptors are involved. Once again, I'll go over shortly here. So every time you do it, you're getting less of a dopamine spike. So you need to do more and more. And that's where this really comes into play, because, oh, hey, that first time I did cocaine, I felt really freaking good. Second time, not as great. So I should probably do more. Oh, I did more. So I feel great now. Do it again. again, oh, I didn't feel as good. So this is what happens. And those who have been addicted to substances like that can relate. They understand that. That's where that chasing the dragon comes from. But this too, like I channeled my addiction to supplements. This is why I'm so well versed in supplements, because the more pills that I took, the better I felt. Whether that supplement was actually doing something for my physiology, it was spiking my dopamine, which made me feel great and made me feel like, oh yes, this liver supplement is working for my liver. Oh yes, this thyroid supplement is working. Oh yes, this anti-inflammatory is working. Reality, what was most likely happening was a lot of dopamine secretion. Not saying that it wasn't helping what it was intended to do, just to the efficacy of what I may have thought might not have been. And I probably didn't need that many supplements. So that's a big one there. Impulsiveness. A lot of people know me for impulsiveness. That's, once again, you're trying to build your dopamine. You are self-medicating. Risky behavior, jumping off cliffs, those squirrel suits, driving like an idiot throughout traffic. That's building your dopamine. You have low dopamine, so you're trying to build it. ADD and ADHD. When we look at dopamine is going to also play a huge role in intelligence and the white matter within the brain. A lot of people are unfamiliar with that. ADHD is almost like overactive because you can't control. Think of it like that. And that's where I'm heavily on like choline. ADD is slower, so like a depressed brain. And that is where I'm more focused on dopamine, for example. That's kind of the difference between the two. Poor memory and brain fog, okay? You will see that this will end up in the high section as well. So this is not a good way to base whether you have high or low, but it is a symptom. And depression, once again, the brain has slowed down. It's causing depression. And once again, I combine bipolar with anger. Cravings. This is a really big one. So many of you have heard me say like candida can alter the brain chemistry. What I kind of forgot to mention at the beginning is like dopamine is something that, you know, I feel really knowledgeable about. And then something comes out and I'm like, wow, I got to relearn everything. And I love this topic, but craving is the big one. So yes, candida is altering the brain chemistry, but what's happening is candida is creating more infection within the gut and going back, messing with this, 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 low dopamine. So what happens? We got to eat because that's going to spike our dopamine. So we see a lot of people, especially with obese individuals, because to get obese, you had to eat a lot of food, a lot of poor food probably. So you were spiking that dopamine. As mentioned, you adapt every time. So you spike less and less dopamine. So you eat more and more. Now you're eating extra large pizzas with a tub of ice cream rather than just a couple slices. And so when you look at low dopamine, food cravings are a really big one. You're really just trying to build that dopamine. You are trying to self-medicate. That's why when you look at things that actually like curb those cravings, it involves dopamine. Sleepiness, because once again, dopamine is your motivation to get things done. Like narcolepsy, those people have like minimal dopamine where they just crash anytime, anywhere. You know, for example, people that know me personally, I used to fall asleep driving all the time. I rolled my truck. I fell asleep and rolled down a hill, rolled down into a ravine or whatever. I was lucky to be okay. Just a couple scratches, but that was really poor dopamine at that point in my life. And so I could never stay awake. I was tired all the freaking time and I never wanted to do anything. I just play on my phone because I'm trying to self-medicate. So I didn't actually put that in there, but that can go under addiction, the social media aspect, because you're trying to find something to spike that dopamine. Addiction, porn really spikes the dopamine. Over time adapts. That's why there's a lot more gray matter within the brain when you look at porn addicts. So that's the symptoms or signs, of low. Let's look at the signs of high. Anxiety. When you have high dopamine, dopamine converts to adrenaline. Every adrenaline molecule is once a dopamine molecule. So this can really lead to anxiety. Worrying is a big one. If you really worry all the time, you may have high dopamine. I'll say now, we'll get to that. Women are more prone to be on the high side of dopamine. That'll make sense here in a moment. Paranoia. How many people have you had that have done drugs, marijuana, cocaine, or whatever, and then they're looking through the blinds and they're scared because it increases dopamine. And so it instigates that paranoia. Same with schizophrenia and hallucinations. Now, schizophrenia is we'll go over a graph here soon, but schizophrenia is going to be way on the other side. It's going to be really high dopamine. And the reason research, scientists, whatever, doctors are aware that schizophrenia is high dopamine, because every single medication ever created to address schizophrenia is to lower dopamine. So then they don't have those schizophrenia episodes anymore. Hallucinations. This is a big one. This one is I can relate to this. Maybe not like crazy hallucinations like I'm on psychedelics or whatever, but sometimes, there's a period where my dopamine I could tell was quite high. I was taking a lot of things to boost dopamine. I thought I kept seeing things and like, wow, I swear there was a person there. I swear having a conversation last night with a client. She was like, I feel like I hallucinate all the time. We 100% know after a series of questions and addressing and like diagnosing, she has high dopamine. So hallucinations is a really, really big one. Insomnia, you're active. You're just always active. I'll comment a little more on insomnia once we get into like how to address, because there's a kicker how you know you have high dopamine that is contributing to insomnia. Chronic pain. So I should have put this together, tingling, burning, and numbness, because your pain receptors are under the concept if you don't use it, you lose it. So you are actually always firing pain receptors, but your brain is ignoring them. Like when you're in a healthy state, when you're in a not healthy state and you have high dopamine, you are amplifying those pain signals. So think of like fibromyalgia. So like you wake up one morning and you're like, oh, I feel like I worked out and I didn't work out yesterday. That could be high dopamine. High heart rate, of course, anxiety and everything, increasing blood pressure because adrenaline, adrenals, cortisol, poor memory and brain fog. See, it'll show up there again. That's why it's a symptom, but it's not the best way to diagnose. And I've experienced this too. You're like, oh, I'm just going to take a bunch of dopamine enhancement and I'm going to be a genius. And all of a sudden you're like, I cannot concentrate at all. Too much dopamine. So those are your signs of high and low dopamine. So now causes of low dopamine. So high stress. High stress because it's going to create neurotoxicity. It's going to impact the adrenals. It's going to impact the thyroid. It's going to create a lot more adrenaline. Okay. It's also going to greatly disrupt gut health. 50% of your adrenaline gets pushed through the gut. That adrenaline is like a super fertilizer for bad bugs. So it will cause, good bacteria too, but it will cause bacteria to grow 10,000% more. So adrenaline, it plays a crucial role in impacting the gut. So you want to make sure clearance is good or that you're not converting a lot of adrenaline unless necessary. Even under a fight or flight mode, a good portion of adrenaline still goes through the gut. And then you look at high levels of cortisol, they can damage the gut lining, creating a more suitable environment for overgrowth, for inflammation, you name it. So now we got, gut health here because it's affected by that. So we got SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, inflammation, low HCl, low stomach acid, leaky gut, IBD, IBS. Gut health plays a huge role because gut health is going to affect your inflammation. Your neuroinflammation. We previously saw how it affects genetics. We saw how it affects the growth and the development of the brain. We are talking about neurotransmitter production and clearance. A lot happens in the gut. Gut health is everything. You know that saying, is it innocent until proven guilty? Everybody has a gut issue until proven otherwise. It's the world we live in now. Every single human being most likely has a gut issue. And then you can look at gut health and glyphosate, for example, linked to autism. 99.7% correlation. So gut health is everything when it comes to brain health, mental disorders, cognitive ability, performance, memory, mood, whatever. Fast COMT, catechol methyl transferase. So what that is, that's responsible for clearing your neurotransmitters. It's also responsible for clearing estrogen, so that'll make sense here in a second. But if it's fast, you are clearing them too quickly. Low and high estrogen. Low estrogen is going to cause this to speed up. So menopausal women, this is where depression can come from. They are flushing all their dopamine. Metabolism, you name it. So low estrogen will cause this to speed up. High estrogen will cause this to slow down. So you'll have more dopamine in the brain. So go, okay, Curtis, well, wouldn't that give me high dopamine? Okay, yes, but chronic periods, because of the receptors downregulating, make more sense here soon, that could lead to low dopamine. So your estrogen plays a huge role in there. Going back to anger. So you see high testosterone. Let's talk about roid rate. Not only are performance enhancing drugs going to impact the liver and the adrenals, especially the liver because of flushing chemicals, and it's just hard on the liver, especially if you're doing hardcore orals, but testosterone flushes dopamine out of the brain. This is why if you look at the percentage of men to women, boys to girls, boys and men have significantly higher a chance of ADD and ADHD. This is why men also do stupid stuff. Men do dumb stuff because they're trying to build dopamine because their testosterone is flushing it out and they have lower estrogen. So their COMT is usually faster. Now take performance enhancing drugs. What does every bodybuilder do? Oh, we got to tank my estrogen. Low estrogen, fast COMT. You are flushing your dopamine. This is where roid rage comes from. That doesn't mean you can't do performance enhancing drugs without experiencing that. There are ways to do it. Stop taking your estrogen is one of them. Okay, and just be healthy. But yeah, testosterone plays a huge role in low dopamine. That's why boys and men are more prone to ADHD, ADD, and doing stupid stuff. What's that saying? Men die sooner than women or whatever. Methylation, that's the act of turning things on and off, but it's heavily involved in neurotransmitter production and clearance. So if this is fast, you could be clearing neurotransmitters too much. If this is slow, you might not be building enough. Malnourishment, because we need the nutrients, we need the building blocks to build this. We need it to affect every other system we've already talked about. So malnourishment's a big one. Social media, once again, we use social media to build dopamine, but if we're not getting the response that we're looking for, we're going to have low dopamine, or if we're chronically addicted to social media, we're going to have low dopamine. Chronic THC use. This one is huge for me. A lot of people, yes, marijuana has some significant benefits in terms of inflammation, like cancer studies and stuff, but long-term exposure decreases dopamine. I'll jump real quick. Acute THC can cause high dopamine. That's why people get paranoid or they get anxiety, and then some stoners like, you're just not doing the right strain. No, you have high dopamine. Chronic THC use is going to cause that high spike in dopamine, but then those receptors are going to downregulate, and it's going to lead to low dopamine. And CBD, one use, it decreases dopamine. That's why it can help with sleep with people with overactive minds, because it's decreasing that dopamine. And then that inverse relationship of serotonin to dopamine. This is why CBD can really help us sleep. But this is why you probably wouldn't want to be doing CBD during the day if you're someone who struggles with motivation or low dopamine symptoms. Same with THC. You talk about cravings. This is why THC can make you eat, because your dopamine crashed. So you're trying to build that dopamine by having the munchies. So THC is a really, really big one. I know people personally, and I have clients that have abused this, and then their health problems just are not getting any better. It's because of how much that chronic usage is affecting their dopamine. Once again, high stress, especially if you have slow conversion from dopamine to adrenaline, because then the dopamine is built up. Or like you can slow down the gene responsible for dopamine reintake, and then that will result in high levels of dopamine in the brain. Addiction, especially acutely, because it spikes dopamine. So you can have high dopamine there. If you're addicted, but you have slow COMT, you're going to keep a lot more dopamine in the brain. Remember that COMT is responsible for flushing it. So if it's slow at flushing it. Pregnant women, this is why this is where postpartum depression comes from, because when you are pregnant, hormones are high. So you slow this down, so you're keeping a bunch of dopamine in the brain. As soon as you give birth, those hormones plummet. And then next thing you know, you are depressed because you flushed out all your dopamine. So this is where looking into your hormones, talk to your doctor, can really help with that postpartum depression. As mentioned, high estrogen is how it affects COMT. Once again, methylation might not be clear enough, might be building too much. Medications, so we talk Ritalin, Adderall, Dexedrine. I have done all those personally. They've given me massive anxiety over time because of putting too much dopamine and then crazy crashes afterwards. These are methamphetamines. These are drugs. You don't need Ritalin. Acutely, sure. If it's what gets you out of this hole that you're in order to correct all this kind of stuff, then okay, short-term medication, but otherwise you don't need it. Social media, again, constantly scrolling can build too much dopamine. And then, as mentioned, acute THC use are some causes of high dopamine. I'll also say too, low dopamine will be like the bipolar aspect. So you get angry and then you're fine the next second. High dopamine, you get angry and you stay angry because you're just constantly converting that dopamine to adrenaline. People who stay angry long probably have a slow COMT and high dopamine. Okay, you'll see that on a genetic test or a Dutch test, for example. The COMT you'll see anyway. So here's what I was talking about with receptors and stuff. I kind of hope this graph makes sense. Here's our dopamine receptors. This purplish, whatever going into here is our dopamine receptors. And here's our dopamine level. So as our dopamine level goes up, our dopamine receptors go down. It's that adaptation, because if this kept going up and this stayed up, like you'd freak out, you'd be anxious, you could cause brain damage, all that kind of stuff. So this is why the receptors go down. Now remember when I said dopamine has a 2-second half-life? The receptors are on like a weekly basis. So what could happen is you could spike the hell out of your dopamine, down-regulate your receptors, and then you're struggling with issues and like dopamine issues and you're trying to address it. But what's going on is it just takes time for these receptors to come back up. And another thing too, when you look at anxiety, this is why I always call it an overproduction of stress hormones. Let's say, your dopamine is low, so your receptors are high. All of a sudden you get a phone call, bad news, you get this huge spike of dopamine. Remember, dopamine half-life 2 seconds, this is weeks. So receptors are still high, so it just soaks up that dopamine, and next thing you know, you got crazy amounts of anxiety. Your heart rate increases, that's adrenaline, norepinephrine and epinephrine. So we want to be in the middle. We want to be in this sweet spot, okay? This sweet spot, you're going to have good memory, mental focus. You're not going to be doing risky things. You're not going to be jumping off a cliff. And I'll say too, you have people who are terrified of, let's say, they just absolutely do skydiving. They probably got good dopamine because they don't need that dopamine spike. Some people might want to do it for fun in the life experience, but they're not like, I need this dopamine spike. So that's people who are really good at saying no to drugs, for example, or have minimal cravings. They're probably in this optimal dopamine level. Intelligence is highly correlated right here, as I mentioned, white matter in the brain. So this is where we want to be. This is in the middle here of this graph. Now, dopamine changes minute to minute. Remember, 2-second half-life. So it could be quite difficult to manage that, especially if you're in a poor environment with poor health. So it's important that you really take care of that to greatly manage and give yourself the ability to stay more in this range. We'll say here, okay? I should have drew some lines, my apologies, rather than here or here is what we want to do. Take a good look at that graph. And if, like I said, if you have any questions on that, please drop them in the comments below. So I'm going to stop there and I will save the addressing, how we're going to address this for part 2. But this way you guys can get a good understanding of what is dopamine, what are some of the signs of high or low dopamine, and understanding this graph here, and then seeing the importance of like those slides. They are very complicated, but like I said, it just kind of emphasizes, okay, how important is gut health when it comes to dopamine and your brain health. So I hope you guys enjoyed that video. If you did, please hit the like and subscribe button and follow me on Instagram at that.coach.curtis.